If you know that name, then you know something nobody put on this wall. Rachel Bennett said nothing after that. She stood beneath the cool white lights of the Naval Aviation Heritage Hall in San Diego, her hands resting loosely beside a plain leather purse, her eyes fixed on a photograph taken more than 40 years earlier. Afternoon sunlight spilled through tall windows facing the bay. Somewhere behind her, coffee cups touched saucers and retired sailors traded stories in low voices. The photograph showed 6 naval aviators gathered around a briefing table. The printed caption listed their names, assignments, and the year. Rachel leaned closer to the glass. Her attention settled on the tall man near the center. "Mad Dog," she whispered. 10 feet away, retired Chief Petty Officer Frank Dalton stopped with a coffee cup halfway to his mouth. He turned slowly. Lieutenant Connor Blake noticed the reaction and smiled. "You all right, Chief?" Frank did not answer him. His eyes stayed on Rachel. He set his coffee down and crossed the polished floor. "Ma'am," he said. Rachel looked over. Frank pointed toward the photograph. "What did you just call him?" Connor stepped closer, still wearing the easy expression of a younger officer who believed he already understood the situation. Rachel's visitor badge said only guest. No rank. No unit. No service history. To Connor, she looked like one of the military family members invited to the symposium. "She probably heard the nickname from somebody here," he said. Frank ignored him. "Who told you that name?" Rachel glanced back at the photograph. "Nobody told me today." Frank's expression tightened. Connor looked at the caption. "Maybe it is written somewhere in the exhibit." "It is not," Frank said. Connor checked anyway. He read every line beneath the photograph. Commander David Bennett appeared among the names, but there was no call sign. No mention of Mad Dog. Rachel watched without amusement. "That nickname was never something David advertised," she said. Frank's eyes sharpened at the first name. "You knew Commander Bennett?" Rachel considered the question. "I knew him before he learned to tolerate that name." The noise of the hall seemed to recede for Frank. Connor gave a short, uncertain laugh. "That could mean a lot of things." "Yes," Rachel said. "It could." She offered nothing more. That bothered Connor more than a boast would have. Frank studied her face, as if searching through an old memory that refused to come into focus. "I heard that call sign aboard ship," he said. "There were maybe a few dozen people who used it comfortably." Rachel nodded. "Fewer after he made commander." Frank almost smiled. "That sounds like him." Rachel turned back toward the photograph. Her eyes moved past David to the briefing table, then toward a wall clock barely visible near the edge of the frame. Something in her expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition. Connor noticed it this time. "What are you looking at?" he asked. Rachel stepped half a foot closer to the glass. "That clock." Frank followed her gaze. Connor squinted at the faded image. "What about it?" Rachel remained silent for several seconds. Then she said it was always fast. Connor looked at Frank. Frank was no longer smiling. "How fast?" he asked. Rachel kept her eyes on the photograph. That depended on whether David had tried fixing it again. Frank slowly lowered his gaze toward the exhibit caption. For the first time that afternoon, Connor stopped wondering how an ordinary guest knew an old call sign. He began wondering why a Navy veteran standing beside him suddenly looked as though everyone in the room had misunderstood exactly who she was. Connor Blake looked again at Rachel Bennett's badge, as if the word guest might suddenly explain what he had just heard. It did not. Around them, the symposium continued with the comfortable rhythm of old reunions and professional conversation, but Frank Dalton had become completely still. Rachel remained focused on the photograph. "You remember the clock being fast?" Connor asked. "I remember people blaming it when they were late," Rachel said. Frank gave a quiet breath that almost became a laugh. "That sounds familiar." Connor folded his arms. "Mrs. Bennett, were you stationed here?" Rachel glanced at him. "Not here." "Then you visited?" "Sometimes." Her answers were precise and frustratingly small. Connor had spent enough time around military families to recognize people who carried pieces of someone else's service through stories repeated at dinner tables and reunions. He assumed Rachel was one of them. Perhaps David Bennett had been her brother. Perhaps her husband. Either possibility could explain the familiarity without making the mystery extraordinary. Frank, however, was watching her differently. He pointed toward the briefing table in the photograph. "Do you recognize anything else?" Connor turned toward him. "Chief, we should probably let her enjoy the exhibit." Rachel saved Frank from answering. "The coffee stain is hidden by the folder." Connor leaned toward the glass. "What coffee stain?" Rachel indicated the right side of the table. "Under that briefing folder." There was a dark ring in the wood that never completely came out. Frank stared at the spot. Nothing visible in the photograph confirmed it. "How do you remember that?" Rachel's eyes softened. "Because everyone complained about the coffee, but nobody stopped drinking it." Frank looked down at his own cup and finally smiled. Some traditions survive. Connor still was not convinced. "That could have been true in every ready room in the Navy." "Probably," Rachel said. She did not defend herself. That unsettled him. People exaggerating old connections usually wanted to be believed. Rachel seemed indifferent to whether he believed anything. She moved 2 steps along the exhibit and stopped before another enlarged image from the same period. Frank followed. Connor hesitated, then followed too. Rachel studied the room shown behind the aviators. "They moved the chair," she said. Connor looked at her. "What chair?" "The one beside the cabinet." Frank examined the image. "You remember where a chair sat 40 years ago?" "I remember everyone walking around it because one leg was shorter than the others." Frank's expression changed again. "It rocked." Rachel nodded. "And David refused to throw it away. Because he said furniture only needed 3 good legs if nobody leaned back." Rachel finally laughed, quietly. That was exactly his argument. Connor looked between them. Frank had not supplied the answer. Rachel had. A voice from the presentation area announced that the next heritage briefing would begin in 5 minutes. Attendees started moving toward rows of chairs facing a projection screen. Connor glanced at Rachel's badge once more. "Are you here because of Commander Bennett?" Rachel adjusted the strap of her purse. "Partly." "Family?" Connor asked. Frank turned sharply toward him, but Rachel showed no offense. "Yes." Connor nodded, satisfied that his original assumption had been mostly correct. Frank was not satisfied at all. As Rachel walked toward the presentation area, he stayed beside Connor. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "you're asking the wrong question." Connor watched Rachel take an empty seat near the back. "What question should I be asking?" Frank looked toward the old photograph, then at the clock frozen inside it. "Not how she knew David Bennett." He paused. "Ask yourself why she remembers the room better than the men whose names are printed under the picture." The presentation had been underway for less than 10 minutes when Rachel Bennett stopped looking at the speaker and started looking at the clock on the projected slide. The image was the same briefing room from the exhibit, enlarged until every faded mark on the board could be seen. Connor Blake sat 2 rows ahead of her. Frank Dalton took the chair beside him. The presenter explained that the photograph documented a training debrief led by Commander David Bennett, a session later remembered for exposing a timing assumption that had affected the exercise plan. A digital timeline appeared beside the photograph. Rachel's expression changed. "That is 1 minute late," she said quietly. Connor heard her and turned. "What is?" "The decision point." The presenter continued speaking. Connor lowered his voice. "The archive lists it at 14:23. Rachel looked at him. "Then the archive summary is wrong." Connor's eyebrows rose. "You remember a single minute from more than 40 years ago?" "I remember the argument about it." Frank leaned slightly forward. "What time should it be?" 14:22. Connor glanced toward the screen again. "That is a very specific memory." Rachel gave him the same calm look she had given him beside the photograph. "Specific does not mean impossible." The presenter advanced to an enlarged copy of a typed archival note. Connor studied it. At the bottom was a reference number and a handwritten notation too small to read from their seats. He raised his hand. When the presenter acknowledged him, Connor asked whether the original source record was available. The presenter seemed surprised, but nodded toward a tablet at the side table containing digitized supporting documents. During the brief discussion that followed, Connor stepped over and opened the referenced file. Frank joined him. Rachel stayed seated. Connor enlarged the scan page. The typed summary showed 1423. Below it, however, a handwritten correction appeared beside the original debrief entry. 1422. Connor stared at the screen. Frank said nothing. Connor checked the reference twice before returning to Rachel. You were right. Rachel nodded once. The clock was fast. By 1 minute? That afternoon, yes. Connor sat down slowly. You said earlier it depended on whether Commander Bennett had tried fixing it. David believed clocks were simpler than people. Frank smiled faintly. Was he wrong? Frequently. Connor looked at her badge again, but now the word guest seemed almost absurdly incomplete. Mrs. Bennett, were you present at that debrief? Rachel watched the projected photograph. Yes. Why are you not listed? Not everyone in the room was standing in front of the camera. The answer landed harder than Connor expected. He looked at the 6 men in the photograph, then at the narrow strip of empty space beyond the briefing table. What happened at 1422? He asked. Rachel's fingers rested against the edge of her purse. Someone finally asked the right question. Commander Bennett? Rachel did not answer immediately. The presenter began explaining how the timing discrepancy later influenced training discussions. Rachel listened for several seconds before speaking. People remember conclusions better than conversations. Connor turned toward her. What does that mean? It means history gets cleaner every time somebody retells it. Frank looked from Rachel to the screen. Something in that sentence seemed to confirm a suspicion he had not yet shared. Connor was no longer interested in proving her memory wrong. What was the question? Rachel met his eyes. You are still trying to start with the answer. Connor frowned. Then where should I start? Rachel looked toward the old wall clock frozen inside the photograph. Ask what everyone in that room believed was true simply because nobody had challenged it yet. The presenter advanced the slide, but Connor barely noticed. For the first time that afternoon, the 1-minute difference no longer seemed like an insignificant archival correction. It felt like the edge of a story somebody had forgotten to include. When the presentation ended, Frank Dalton did not follow the crowd toward the coffee station. He waited until Rachel Bennett stood, then walked beside her toward the photograph again. Connor Blake followed a few steps behind, no longer pretending curiosity had nothing to do with it. Frank stopped near the display and looked at Rachel carefully. I want to ask you something that is not in any archive. Rachel adjusted the strap of her purse. That sounds dangerous. Frank almost smiled. What did Mad Dog do when the room got too quiet? Connor expected Rachel to ask what he meant. She did not. Her gaze drifted toward David Bennett's photograph, and for a moment the years seemed to disappear from her face. He checked the clock, she said. Frank's expression hardened with recognition. Rachel continued, then he looked toward the window and pretended he was checking the weather. Frank slowly nodded. Why? Connor asked. Rachel looked at him. Because David hated silence when he knew somebody disagreed with him. Frank let out a quiet laugh. That is exactly what he did. Connor glanced between them. You saw him do that? More times than I can count. Frank stepped closer to the photograph. I saw it twice. Both times, somebody had challenged his briefing. Rachel's smile was faint. Then you saw him on good days. Good days. The difficult days were when nobody challenged him. Connor studied her. Every answer opened another door instead of closing one. Why would that be worse? Rachel looked toward the old briefing table. Because confidence can become expensive when everyone in a room borrows it from the same person. Connor did not answer. Frank noticed. That bother you, Lieutenant? No. I am thinking about it. Rachel nodded. Good. Frank folded his arms. There is another thing. He pointed toward the chair visible beside the cabinet. You said David refused to throw that chair away. He did. Do you remember what he called it? Rachel finally looked amused. Government property. Frank laughed immediately. That was his answer to everything. Only when he wanted people to stop asking questions. Connor shook his head. None of this could be on a plaque. That is why I asked, Frank said. His voice had changed. The test was over. He was no longer trying to decide whether Rachel belonged to the memory. He was trying to understand how deeply she belonged to it. Rachel seemed to recognize that shift. You knew David? She asked. Not well. I was a young petty officer when I first heard his call sign. Later I sat through 2 briefings where he was present. Frank paused. People remembered him. David made that easy. But I remember something else. Rachel waited. Frank looked toward the wall clock in the photograph. After one of those briefings, somebody told me that if Mad Dog ever started checking the clock, it meant the smartest person in the room had stopped agreeing with him. Rachel's expression became still. Connor noticed immediately. Who was that person? He asked. Rachel did not answer. Frank watched her closely. I never knew the name, he said. I only heard that David trusted that person enough to become irritated when they stayed quiet. Rachel lowered her eyes for a moment. That sounds like David. Connor stepped nearer. Was it you? Rachel looked directly at him. You're asking for a conclusion again. Connor caught himself. Earlier, that response would have frustrated him. Now he understood it was deliberate. Then what should I ask? Rachel turned toward the photograph. Ask. Why 1422 mattered. Frank's eyes moved to her. Connor waited. Rachel studied David's younger face behind the glass. Everyone remembers that afternoon as the day David found a problem in the timeline, she said. That is not what happened. Connor felt the room around them become strangely distant. Then what happened? Rachel looked at the clock frozen in the photograph. At 1422, David was still defending the wrong assumption. The ticking of the old wall clock had been louder than anyone remembered. Rachel could still hear it beneath the voices in the briefing room, steady and irritating, while David Bennett stood beside a board covered with times, arrows, and handwritten notes. He was younger then, confident enough to make confidence look effortless. Around the table, instructors and aviators followed his explanation as he worked through the training sequence. Rachel stood near the far end with a notebook closed beneath one hand. David pointed to the timeline. The problem starts here. Nobody disagreed. That was what bothered her. She looked from the board to the clock, then back to the first decision point. The room had accepted David's starting condition before anyone had tested whether it deserved to be accepted. Rachel waited until he finished. David noticed her silence before anyone else did. His eyes moved toward the clock, then toward the window. He pretended to study the weather outside. Rachel almost smiled. You disagree, he finally said. I have not said anything. That has never stopped you from disagreeing. Several people around the table smiled, but Rachel kept looking at the board. Why are you measuring from that point? David tapped the timeline. Because that is when the sequence begins. Is it? The room became quiet. David looked at the board again. That is what the planning sheet says. Rachel nodded. The planning sheet records when the sequence was expected to begin. I am asking when the decision actually became necessary. David's expression changed slightly. Same difference. Then prove it. Nobody laughed this time. Rachel stepped closer, not to take over the briefing, but to indicate the earlier mark on the timeline. What happens if you start here instead? David studied it. That changes the reference. Exactly. By 1 minute. 1 minute is not important because it is 60 seconds, Rachel said. It is important because it tells you whether you are measuring the event or measuring your assumption about the event. David stared at the board. The clock ticked behind them. Rachel watched the argument leave his face before his posture changed. He erased one mark and moved it backward. Then he recalculated the sequence. Nobody spoke. A minute later, David placed the marker on the table. 1422. Rachel nodded. Now ask the question again. David did. This time the problem appeared somewhere else entirely. What later became remembered as David Bennett's discovery had begun with a question he had not asked. Back in the Heritage Hall, Rachel's eyes remained on the photograph while Connor Blake and Frank Dalton waited. He changed his mind? Connor asked. Rachel returned fully to the present. He checked the work. After you challenged him. After I challenged the assumption. Frank studied her. And that became the lesson people remembered? Not immediately. David rebuilt the debrief. Other instructors tested it. Students found better ways to explain it. Eventually, the original argument became less important than what people learned from it. Connor looked toward the caption beneath David's photograph. But the exhibit says Commander Bennett identified the timing flaw. Rachel's voice stayed calm. David did identify it. Connor frowned. After you showed him where to look. That does not make the sentence false. It makes it incomplete. Frank's gaze remained fixed on Rachel. Something about the way she refused to claim ownership seemed more convincing than any resume could have been. You were not just visiting those rooms, he said. Rachel did not answer. Connor looked at her. Were you working with the instructors? Rachel's eyes moved back to David. I worked with David. As what? She gave Connor a small, patient look. You are still trying to solve the person before you understand the lesson. Connor almost objected, then stopped himself. Frank noticed and smiled faintly. Rachel turned toward the wall clock in the photograph. 14:22 mattered because that was the moment David stopped protecting his answer. Connor waited. Rachel's expression softened and started listening. Frank Dalton stayed quiet after Rachel Bennett finished speaking. The Heritage Hall had begun filling again as attendees returned from the presentation, but his attention remained on her. Something old was moving through his memory. Not the photograph. Not the clock. A conversation. Years earlier, David Bennett had been standing near a hangar door after a training session, complaining about an argument he had clearly lost. Frank had been young enough to assume senior officers disliked being corrected. David had laughed when Frank suggested it. If Bennett is arguing, find Rachel, David had said. She already knows where the assumption broke. At the time, Frank thought Bennett was referring to another instructor everyone knew. Now the sentence returned with uncomfortable clarity. Frank looked at Rachel. Your first name is Rachel. She gave him a curious look. It has been for quite a while. Connor Blake smiled, but Frank did not. Rachel Bennett. Her expression became still. Yes. Frank turned toward David's photograph. The shared last name suddenly changed the shape of everything. Connor saw it too. You were related to Commander Bennett. Rachel looked at him. I was married to him. Connor's confidence disappeared. Mad Dog was your husband? David was my husband, Rachel corrected gently. Mad Dog belonged to everybody else. Frank lowered his head for a second, almost embarrassed that he had needed so long to connect the names. Then another memory surfaced. David had never described Rachel merely as his wife. He had spoken about her judgment, her questions, her refusal to let a room confuse agreement with accuracy. Frank looked back at her visitor badge. Guest. Nothing more. Why does this not mention your service? He asked. Rachel glanced down. Because I registered as a guest. That was not what I asked. Rachel understood him. I did not come here to display a resume. Chief. Connor looked toward the photograph again. Were you an instructor? Rachel picked up her purse from the edge of a nearby chair. You are persistent, Lieutenant. I am trying to stop making assumptions. That earned the smallest smile from her. Then keep practicing. Frank stepped several feet away and pulled out his phone. Rachel noticed immediately. Frank. He stopped. I need to confirm something. You do not need to confirm me. This is not about proving who you are. Frank looked toward the exhibit caption. It is about figuring out how much of this story everyone has been telling wrong. Rachel's expression tightened slightly. Incomplete is not the same as wrong. Fair enough. Frank searched his contacts and found a number he had not used in nearly 2 years. Connor watched. Who are you calling? Someone who knew that generation better than I did. Frank pressed the number. The call connected after several rings. His posture straightened instinctively. Admiral Callahan, this is Frank Dalton. I apologize for bothering you during the symposium. He listened. Yes, sir. I am already here. Another pause. Frank looked directly at Rachel. I need to ask about Commander David Bennett. Mad Dog. The response on the other end was too quiet for Connor to hear. Frank continued. Do you remember someone named Rachel Bennett? Silence followed. Frank's expression changed. Yes, sir. She is standing about 15 feet from me. Connor glanced at Rachel. She closed her eyes briefly, as though she already knew exactly what was coming. Frank listened for several seconds. Understood, Admiral. Then he lowered the phone. Connor stepped closer. What did he say? Frank did not answer immediately. Rachel did. Stephen told him not to make a scene. Frank almost smiled. Not exactly. Connor waited. Frank looked at him. He said he is coming over. Why? Frank slipped the phone into his pocket. And he gave me one instruction. Rachel looked toward the windows, resigned now. Connor asked, what instruction? Frank's voice became quiet. Do not introduce her as Mad Dog's widow. Connor Blake kept hearing Frank Dalton's last sentence long after the phone disappeared into the retired chief's pocket. Do not introduce her as Mad Dog's widow. The words changed the question completely. Connor looked at Rachel Bennett, but she had already turned toward the presentation area, where a smaller afternoon session was beginning. An instructor placed a simplified training scenario on the screen and invited several junior officers to work through it. Connor was among them. Normally, he would have welcomed the exercise. Now he was distracted by the woman sitting quietly 20 feet behind him. The scenario appeared straightforward: a training flight, changing weather, limited fuel margin, and a sequence of decisions built around a scheduled departure time. Connor studied the information and explained his solution. The instructor nodded. Reasonable. Anyone see another approach? Silence followed. Connor glanced toward Rachel. She was studying the screen with the same expression she had worn while examining the old clock. Mrs. Bennett, he asked. Rachel looked at him. Yes. You see something. Why do you think that? Because you were looking at my timeline instead of me. Frank covered a smile. Rachel leaned back slightly. Would you like an answer or a question? Connor remembered 1422. A question. Rachel nodded toward the screen. What are you treating as true simply because nobody questioned it? Connor looked at the scenario again. The weather report? That is information. Try again. He examined the fuel figures. The fuel estimate? Also information. Connor's eyes moved across the timeline. The scheduled departure sat at the beginning of every calculation he had made. The departure time. Rachel said nothing. Connor looked closer. The scenario says the flight is scheduled to depart at 13:30. Does scheduled mean fixed? She asked. Connor reread the wording. No. Then why did you make it fixed? The room became quiet. Connor erased his first timeline and moved the departure 12 minutes earlier. The weather window changed. So did the fuel margin. A conflict he had spent several minutes trying to manage simply disappeared. Connor stared at his revised plan. I built every decision on a condition that was never actually required. Rachel nodded. Now ask what else changes. Connor worked through the sequence again. This time he found the second consequence without help. Then the third. When he finished, the instructor looked impressed. Connor was not looking at him. That is what you did with David, he said. Rachel's expression remained calm. What did I do? You did not tell him his answer was wrong. You made him find the assumption underneath it. Frank watched her closely. Rachel gave Connor a small nod. That usually lasts longer than giving someone the answer. Connor stepped away from the screen. The embarrassment he might have felt earlier was gone. In its place was curiosity. Were you teaching him? Sometimes David taught me. That was not my question. Rachel almost smiled. You are improving. Frank glanced toward the entrance. Admiral Callahan told me not to explain anything before he arrived. Connor turned. He actually said that? Almost word for word. Rachel shook her head. Stephen always enjoyed unnecessary drama. Connor looked back at the corrected timeline. Then I can wait. Good, Rachel said. Waiting is another useful skill. The doors at the rear of the hall opened. Conversation nearest the entrance faded first. Rear Admiral Stephen Callahan entered with a staff officer, acknowledged 2 greetings, then scanned the room. His eyes found Rachel almost immediately. His formal expression softened. He crossed the floor without stopping at the exhibit or speaking to Connor. Rachel rose as he approached. Callahan stopped in front of her and studied her for a moment. Still asking questions nobody wants to answer? Rachel replied, only when everyone likes the answer too much. Callahan laughed quietly. Then he looked at the revised scenario on the screen and turned toward Connor. Lieutenant, did she give you the solution? No, sir. Good. Callahan looked back at Rachel with unmistakable respect. She never did. Rear Admiral Stephen Callahan let the silence settle before turning toward the old photograph across the hall. I have not seen that picture in years, he said. Rachel Bennett followed his gaze. It has survived better than the coffee did. Frank Dalton laughed, but Connor Blake remained focused on Callahan. Sir, Chief Dalton said you told him not to introduce Mrs. Bennett as Commander Bennett's widow. Callahan looked at Connor. That is correct. Why? Rachel sighed softly. Stephen. Callahan raised one hand. I will keep it accurate. He stepped toward the display, and the others followed. David Bennett was a respected instructor. He was demanding, memorable, and stubborn enough to earn a call sign he pretended to dislike. Rachel's mouth lifted slightly. Pretended. That is how I remember it. Callahan stopped before the photograph. But Rachel did not become important because she married David. Connor said nothing. Callahan continued. She served in naval aviation training. More importantly, she became the kind of instructor people remembered years after they forgot the exact lesson plan. Connor glanced at Rachel. She looked mildly uncomfortable with the attention. What made her different? He asked. Callahan pointed toward the training scenario Connor had just corrected. You already experienced it. Connor understood. The questions. Exactly. Rachel rarely rescued students from their own reasoning. She made them examine it. Frank looked at her. David learned that from you too. Rachel answered before Callahan could. David had plenty to teach me. Callahan nodded. That is true. They challenged each other. That is the part history tends to lose when it turns people into legends. Connor looked toward the caption beneath David's photograph. So the 1422 lesson was hers? No, Rachel said immediately. Her voice was quiet, but firm. It belonged to everyone who improved it. Callahan smiled as if he had expected that answer. That is Rachel. He turned back to Connor. She identified the assumption. David rebuilt the debrief around it. Other instructors tested the idea. Students carried it forward. Years later, people remembered David standing at the board because that was the photograph they had. Connor looked again at the image. 6 men stood around the table. Rachel was nowhere inside the frame. And nobody remembered who asked the first question. Some of us did, Callahan said. Frank's eyes narrowed with recognition. That was what David meant. Rachel looked at him. Frank repeated the memory slowly. If Bennett is arguing, find Rachel. She already knows where the assumption broke. Callahan laughed. He said that more than once. Rachel shook her head. Usually after ignoring me for 20 minutes. Which is why he remembered the lesson. Connor looked embarrassed. I saw a guest on her badge and assumed she was here because of Commander Bennett. Rachel met his eyes. You were partly right. But I decided that explained you. She waited. Connor continued. That was the mistake. Callahan nodded. Rank, medals, biographies, those things can tell you where someone has been. They cannot tell you whether you should listen. You discover that by listening. Connor looked toward the corrected training scenario still glowing on the screen. He had expected the admiral to reveal some impossible secret, a hidden award, or a dramatic achievement that would justify Rachel's importance. Instead, the proof had already happened before Callahan entered the room. She had seen the weakness in his reasoning because she had spent years teaching people how to find weaknesses in their own. Frank picked up his forgotten coffee cup and stared into it. I suppose this means I owe you an apology too. Rachel looked at him. For what? Taking this long to remember. Her expression softened. You remembered David. Everybody remembered David. Rachel turned toward the photograph. He made that easy. Connor studied the empty edge of the image where someone outside the camera's view might once have been standing. Maybe that is the problem, he said. Rachel looked at him. What is? We keep assuming the person in the center of the photograph is the person who changed the room. Callahan said nothing. Neither did Frank. Rachel's eyes returned to the old wall clock. After a moment, she gave Connor one small approving nod. This time, he understood exactly what it meant. By late afternoon, sunlight from San Diego Bay had turned the windows gold, and the Heritage Hall was beginning to empty. Rachel. Bennett stood before the old photograph one final time. Frank Dalton remained nearby with the same cup of coffee he had forgotten to finish, while Rear Admiral Stephen Callahan spoke quietly with the symposium coordinator. Connor Blake approached Rachel without the confidence he had carried earlier. This time, he waited until she looked at him. Mrs. Bennet, I owe you an apology. Rachel studied him. For not knowing who I was? No, ma'am. Connor glanced at her badge. For deciding that guest told me everything I needed to know. Rachel gave a small nod. That is a better apology. Connor looked toward David Bennet's photograph. I thought respect became necessary after I learned your history. He paused. I had it backward. I should have listened before I knew whether your history was impressive. Rachel's expression softened. Keep that lesson. It will be more useful than remembering my name. The symposium coordinator joined them with a yellow note in her hand. She explained that the exhibit record could be reviewed before its next public display. We can add your role to the caption, she told Rachel, and clarify the origin of the timing lesson. Rachel looked at Callahan, then at Frank. Do not replace one convenient story with another. The coordinator waited. David helped rebuild the debrief, Rachel continued. Other instructors tested it. Students improved how it was taught. If you change the caption, tell people that. And your contribution? Connor asked. Rachel looked toward the clock in the photograph. Say that an instructor questioned the original decision point. That is enough. Callahan smiled. Still refusing the center of the photograph. Somebody has to leave room for everyone else. The coordinator wrote carefully on the note. There was no announcement and no applause. Just a few sentences being reconsidered because the record had become more accurate. Frank lifted his cold coffee. 40 years later, and somehow the coffee is still the worst part of naval aviation history. Rachel laughed. You should have tasted what David made. Connor smiled, then looked at the photograph again. There is something I still do not understand. Rachel waited. You remembered 1422 immediately. After all these years, why that minute? The humor faded gently from her face. She stepped closer to the glass. David stood frozen beside the briefing board, young and certain, one hand resting near a timeline that history would later simplify. Rachel looked at the old wall clock. Because that was the minute he stopped defending his answer. Connor remembered her words from earlier. And started listening. Rachel nodded. That was always one of David's better qualities. He could be stubborn for 20 minutes, but when the evidence changed, he could change with it. Frank looked toward the photograph. Not everybody can. No, Rachel said. That is why I remembered. Connor finally understood that the 1-minute discrepancy had never mattered because of the clock itself. It mattered because it marked a choice. Pride could have held the room in place. Instead, someone questioned an assumption, someone else listened, and the lesson survived longer than either of them expected. Rachel picked up her purse. Callahan offered to walk her toward the entrance. She shook her head with a smile. I still know how doors work, Stephen. I had to try. She took several steps, then stopped and looked back at David. Mad dog, she said softly. Frank heard it again, but this time he did not freeze. Connor did not search for a hidden meaning. The call sign no longer sounded like a secret password or proof of importance. It sounded like what it had always been to Rachel, a memory of a man she had challenged, respected, loved, and never forgotten. Then she walked toward the doors as the evening light stretched across the floor. Connor remained beside the photograph, looking not at the man in its center, but at the empty space beyond the frame. He would remember Rachel Bennet, but more importantly, he would remember what she had taught him before he knew who she was. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is not the one with the answer. It is the one still willing to question it.